the questions are, do you think that the world is taking HPC as seriously as it needs to solve some pretty big problems, which is a little bit what Andrew said in the morning. About being profitable or not, that's a question that you're welcome to consider or not. What we discussed, and even discussed it at SC, governments, taxpayer society being more and more disconnected about technological and scientific advance. My not last but previous trip to the US, I had dinner with a guy called Moshe Pardi, who is reasonably in Houston, who's known at ACM, and he put in my head, that was before October 7th, how science is losing credibility in one way or other. And I'm wondering if we can do or consider that in terms of certain strategies or investments. Which brings me to the last couple of questions. What are the technologies essential to make the future of computing feasible? And how is power consumption and the supply chains, raw materials? I mean, TSMC and Intel are putting big billions to open fabrics in Arizona or wherever, and this just has been stopped a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Final question, is realistic to aim beyond exascale? Is anyone, and then Fernanda just realized that she was there. So here are the photos. You can identify each, and as usual, the format of the panel is that now I shut up and each of you share the thoughts, and then you debate, and then the floor asks, and that's it.
Okay, so maybe I start by the last one, which was, I think, about what is beyond exascale. I alluded to this a little bit on my talk, so I think that we should focus a bit more just not only on the next leap on performance, but on the next leap on making the use of our systems more efficient, and also to transfer this performance not just from the, so not be just peak performance, but the performance of the applications that run on the systems. So this has to do also with the value of HPC. So the value of HPC is what comes out in terms of results, in terms of new science, in terms of solutions for the problems we have nowadays. And maybe we should put more focus on that. I know many centers are trying to do this, but at least on our perspective, I feel a bit sad that the only time we as a computer centers get on the news, on the main news that the general public sees, is when we get the installation of a huge, massive new system. That's the only time you get to hear from what happens in our site by the general public. Not about when there is a new whatever solution or a new scientific breakthrough that comes from what the work has been done on the machines using this infrastructure.
And that's the fault of the media or the poor PR from the organizations?
I don't know. I think that we probably need to do a bit more on our side to put out there what comes out from the computer as an instrument. At the end, I see the computer as a scientific instrument. What is the science, or in some cases also the industrial results that come out of it? Yeah. At the end, we can do more on our side. What the media then takes up upon is another question. Also, what the politicians then also take more attention on. Maybe we have a bit less of influence, but whatever we can do to improve that, it's better.
Because my lesson learned through the SKA project, something that as an entrepreneur prior to that wasn't a concern. I learned the value of the word outreach.
Yeah.
You do stuff, but then because you're dealing with deep tech, and you are not putting something in the hands of someone that immediately can handle it. It's like inventing the microwave before people know that what means. So the first guys just put the hand, if you how it works.
Yep.
All right. The day that realized that was when my lawyer in a small town south of here, and I was trying to explain a little bit of what I was trying to do in platform, and immediately asked me, and this has something to do with quantum computing. And I made a huge effort to not smile. But that put me, okay, this is not going how I thought it should be. General public have some perceptions, and the general public put power in the hands of government officials, which take decisions that influence everything else, which I'm not saying anything here. Anyway, just a thought. I should shut up. So see if you're done.
Well, I actually. Okay, so one of my thoughts when I read the questions is, I think it's important to step back and ask, what are we really trying to accomplish, right? And it actually goes into kind of the discussion you and Estella just had, which is, why do SKA, right? Why are we doing science in general, right? When you ask, do we need bigger machines? Do they need to be more efficient? I think you'll get different answers if you assume different motivations for doing it. So let me just lay out a few motivations, right? Putting aside the Russian issue, why did we go to the moon, right? Lots of people have different views about that. I'm an explorer. I read science fiction. I would want to go to the moon because it pushes humanity forward. It pushes society forward. So to me, just personally, not wearing my industry hat or whatever, there's just a lot of intrinsic value to driving science forward, to helping humanity better understand the nature of the universe, the nature of ourselves, the nature of whatever it is that we're studying. So if you put that hat on, I think we don't have near enough the amount of computing that we need in order to solve some of these fundamental science problems. And I'd even like to believe that part of creating this new computing is in itself, there's certainly engineering aspects as well, but there's been science that's come out of driving some of the advancements that's happened, actually in the production of the supercomputers, in addition to the fact that supercomputers, so I always admire domain scientists. I was talking to Doug about this, who, he isn't here, but is a domain scientist. So, I was very boring. I got my BS in computer science. I got my master's in I got my PhD in computer science, but some of these people who, but in the end, we're not building machines to do computer science. We're building machines to do science from this perspective. I'm going to speak about engineering in a second, right? And so that alone, if you talk about that pursuit, how much money did we spend on like the colliders? I mean, we in some sense we don't spend very much money at all on supercomputing if you look at it from a scientific endeavor point of view, right? Now, if you put on a different hat and you say, okay, now we want an ROI on this, and I fear many times, and I would love to be able to change the public perception conversation about HPC, about AI, about supercomputing to be it being part of about it driving science, because I think then it might, maybe, I don't know, of course in the US you wonder sometimes, but I'm sure it's true about everybody with their politics in their country. I don't know if the public would actually go for that, but it might change the equation of how we evaluate the worth and the amount that we're willing to put into the machines. So I think from that perspective, we're not near far enough. I mean, we need more than Zettascale, right, in order to solve some of these problems. But if you look at it from an engineering and ROI's perspective, I think you might come to a different answer, right? There's a lot of the engineering problems that we're trying to solve. We're getting closer. We can arguably weather is important, from an engineering perspective, except in the U.S. climate isn't, well, actually it's starting to be, but climate's important, right? A lot of these are sort of engineering problems that need to be solved. And from my perspective, I think you would get a different answer. We still need a couple more steps, but I don't think we need, 5 or 10 or unforeseeable number of steps in order to solve some of the engineering problems. So I think it's important, to really think about why it is that we want to do this as we frame the answer to the questions. But I do enjoy the exchange that the two of you had about that. In the end, we get, you have something about, we're using other people's money, and, that's certainly partially true. So, and in your comment about outreach is absolutely on target, right? Because, you talk to some of the DOE leaders, like, Rick or whoever else is going down to DC to try to drum up money. And it's we got to figure out how we can connect with the people who are, the taxpayers, right, who are funding this. So I think that's a very key aspect. I don't know, some random thoughts. Man?
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
I hear Jim telling, and also talk about, okay, we go with the CHIPS Act and this and that, or not Doug the other day, and happily saying, or Manish will also say, okay, we manage dozens of billions of dollars. That's independent of the scale of New Zealand or other country. What I am asking myself is the person who takes the decision versus the person who presents the request. What's the gap? What's the orders of magnitude? I mean, they always, and I had exposure to a number of politicians in different countries in my career. They always think in terms of not only roads, but hospitals, schools, roads, supercomputing, long term. I wish to believe that everyone has good faith, even if I live under a military dictatorship as well. The point is, the gap between one and another is where my concept of outreach enters, which is different than PR, it's different than marketing. It's not winning the souls, it's saying, look, we are doing this for this reason for the others. And it was Clayton Christensen who said in SC 10 or 11 that he was asked by Andy Grove, CEO of Intel, because they knew theory on this and that. And initially he was going to spend the whole day with him. And then they say, no, only half day, no, only 1 hour. So because the guy was busy, okay, you have 10 minutes. So he was going to give a whatever transformational lecture, and he gave the full keynote of SCI, it's recorded, based on how on those 10 minutes he said this and this and this to the CEO of Intel, and said, I get it, thank you, bye. And that changed roadmaps, changed everything. That's what I understand by outreach, more than just PR or marketing.
Yeah, I want to say if they changed the Intel roadmaps in 2013, that's probably not something I'd want to trumpet as my accomplishment.
I'm not at Intel, so I don't have to respond to that. I think when you talk about the gap, there's two gaps though. Just to respond to your comment, one is the gap of many of us have a science and engineering training background, but when you talk to these policy and decision makers, many times they don't. So there's sort of a gap in how you're viewing the problem. But I think more importantly, there's a gap in terms of your evaluation metric, right? Our evaluation metric, are we driving science? Have we been able to, come up with some new invention? Their evaluation metric is how many voters am I going to get with this decision versus that decision? So, the gaps are tough. I think you had a comment.
No, it falls right into that. So, when I started at Oak Ridge National Lab, I was lucky enough to find a wonderful mentor, and a lot of you know him, Jack Wells, and he read a book called Pasteur's Quadrant, and I pulled up the notes because he's like, you should read this book. It's a great book, and it talks exactly this sort of dichotomy, which is, this idea that for us to be able to have tech, we must have science and vice versa. And it challenges us that it's not a linear sort of thing. You don't have science, therefore you get tech. But that's often how we communicate it to funders. This is often how we communicate it to the public. You can have tech without the science. You can have tech ahead of the science. We can do tech and not understand how it works. In fact, some of us would say AI just kind of exploded that way, right? We went kind of... but it works. So we didn't quite understand the intricacies of it, and we're just now finding out so we sort of understood the math, but we didn't understand how it got there, right? So to that point, when you're talking about having outreach, that book I highly recommend. It's called, again, Pasteur's Quadrant. Highly recommend reading it because it talks exactly this. It's like you need to be able to give to people this kind of outreach and explain to them, in a sense, partly what they want to hear, but also it actually speaks to the communities themselves. And there's a point at which, and I was reading my notes, there's a point at which in one of the chapters it talks about how the sciences are so proud that whatever they're doing has no practical use, right? They're so sort of like, well, this doesn't have anything to do with engineering. And that thought, after reading my notes, connected me to a video I just watched from a YouTube channel called Veritasium. I don't know if y'all follow it. Some of the younger folks might follow YouTubers. But Veritasium is a wonderful channel that explains all sorts of really difficult...
What is YouTube?
I'm sorry? And he does a really good job at breaking science down to the public. So talking about outreach, he's amazing at that. And the last one he posted was about the inventor of the blue LED. And that is the most fantastic, Veritasium video ever. He talks about how that person convinces his company in Japan to go and do this research and build the blue LED because the impact would have been, selling everything that we have today in terms of LED TVs, it would have been huge, right? So it would have been without licensing. And it turns out that the owner of the company, the father, it doesn't pass away, but he steps down and the son comes in and the son says, stop your research. And he bucks the son and he says, no, I'm going to continue, and continues doing the stuff. Eventually he gets it. But he was up against the son of the company. He was up against academics because he didn't have a PhD. He was up against, he was shunned by the PhD community. He was shunned by the scientific community. As someone has experienced this personally, as only having a master's, it's been difficult. And in the end, he still got the stupid blue LED. He didn't make any money out of it. And now he teaches over at, I think, University of California, and he's doing amazing stuff. So here's, quote, an outsider that's been able to just essentially he had funding and he was able to do what he wanted. He bucked the system and he did it. And those sorts of innovations, one could point to, for example, SpaceX. We couldn't do that kind of stuff in SpaceX and NASA because you can't waste money blowing up rockets. But a billionaire, a crazy billionaire, can do that. He can blow as many rockets as it's his money. And that kind of innovation and that kind of risk-taking has gone away from public domain. And now we're seeing that kind of domain being done by, private industry. So if we want that in HPC, so much of our funding depends on the public domain and the public cash. We have to find ways to communicate back to the government that we need to take more risks to be able to do things that are big and great in brand.
So about the risk, yes, please.
But I'm going to build on that a little and then eventually get back to the panel. But because there's 4 points I want to make about the future of computing that I'm going to get to at some point, but you baited me into the science policy stuff. So, highly successfully. And I have worked in science policy as well. And I remember one of the fixed training is the first thing they said to us is you're all scientists and engineers and you believe there are problems and that problems have solutions. And the political class doesn't operate that way. They have issues and issues have resolutions. And resolution means people stop calling them and complaining about it, right? It doesn't mean that anything technically has been solved, right? And so, and that was very good advice, along with some other advice I won't repeat from NASA, but on how to talk to politicians. But I'm always amused when my colleagues go to the Hill, Congress in the U.S., and try and make an argument with facts, right? Because it's convenient if the facts support your argument, but it is not a precondition or a necessity to either have facts or to have correct facts or to have them support your argument, right? The way to make an argument is not, is not entirely fact-driven, right? It's like, why does this matter to you and your voters? And that's a very different discussion. And then all of that, but yeah. And I do like the blue LED story. I mean, back Clayton Christensen talk, one of his premises is that almost all disruptive change comes from outsiders, right, in any community. And I would argue that SpaceX, where the rockets don't blow up, they have spontaneous, unscheduled disassemblies. Is the actual term they use? Yes, but it's because, it's impossible for a NASA mission or really any government project to be deemed a failure at this point because that would be a disaster, a waste of taxpayer money. Whereas trial and error is the way to actually get stuff done. So, but while I have the floor, because who knows if it'll come back, there are 4 points I want to make about future of computing, just based on the questions in Nicholas's intro. And the first one is, why do we need to go past exascale? And I think Bob put this well, that it's because the problems take us there, right? As what the politicians want to do aside, right? We have individual science problems that we can point to that require 10 exaflops, 100 exaflops, zettaflop, etc. And then in the aggregate, the pressure is even higher, right? I mean, for all the talk of moving to AI, running a center, the amount of requests we get with traditional scientific computing resources only go in one direction, and that's up. And as the machines get faster, they want even more, right? And there are, many things we can argue about memory demands, storage demands, all those things, but in general, the trajectory is up, right? And things like AI are just enabling more people to consume a lot of resource.
Well, you need to own your own nuclear plant or your own river.
Well, I have a plan, but then I have to sell politicians. But the three sort of technical, well, not even technical, but just trends that I've noticed is that one is the HPC space, from which most of us come, is still an incredibly useful pioneer. in this space. And despite the fact that there's a ton of innovation around AI coming out of industry now, because there is this financial driver to do it that there didn't used to be in technical computing. If you look at modern large-scale, large language models, things that train on thousands of GPUs, they work because, one, algorithmically, Google produced the Transformers paper and took out a lot of the data dependencies that made those things hard to scale. But then they were immediately able to scale because GPUs had been adapted to do general purpose computing, which largely came out of the scientific and technical computing community. They then discovered that interconnects mattered. And if we had a conversation with cloud providers 10 years ago, they would have said, why do you waste all that money in supercomputers on these really expensive interconnects? You don't need them. And now they need them way more than we do. And wish they could get latency down, but bandwidth even more so. And we see NVIDIA putting out DGXs with 8 or 16 high-end InfiniBand cards in them. InfiniBand exists because of the HPC and technical computing market. Yep. And then if you look at the frameworks, they're all based on MPI, because the thing that moves slower than building new chips and technology is the software ecosystem. After 10 years of screwing around with 20 different vendor message passing libraries, we sort of settled on MPI 30 years ago. And that's what Microsoft, and Torsten Hoffler's written a paper about this, but that's what Microsoft DeepSpeed and Horvath with PyTorch and all of these big frameworks are all MPI based at the core, right? So MPI, low latency networks, general purpose GPUs, all of that precondition for doing scalable AI today came out of the scientific and technical computing community, right? So it's a $100 billion industry, which we deserve some credit for, because of what we've done in the past, and we'll always be those pioneers. At the same time, though, I come out of the Beowulf community, right? So I was a young grad student, met Thomas Sterling, Don Becker. Let's put network drivers into Linux. I built the second cluster for Beowulf at Clemson 31 years ago now. And the whole idea was, look, we're not a big enough player to move the market, and certainly not in how we build silicon. We need to adapt to what the commodity computing folks do to drive the bigger markets. And that was the philosophy then, and I think it's a useful philosophy now. And in the interim, there's been some push-pull. The DOE is a lot bigger than us. Arguably, they've been able to nudge the vendors in particular directions. But I think you'll hear more about this in a later talk this afternoon. But in the end, the vendors go where the markets take them. And if it's not what's good for us, then screw us, right? So, and I think we're in the same position now. The market's going to build chips for AI. It's on us. We've heard a little bit about mixed precision algorithms and things like that. We're going to have to exploit what the market builds for AI to do effective scientific and technical computing, or we're going to lose. And we'll have those Samsung-like margins, right? So, and then because Bob's research team takes so much money, but there will always be resource-constrained computing, and this is sort of in response to what Andrew said this morning about, if you look at the value that these machines provide, it's way higher than, a direct ROI in HPC or a flops count. But there's still going to be parts of the world, particularly in research, where we can't drive it on a business case, right? And I mean, I know we have huge ROI on our systems, but, if the goal is to cure cancer, there's an enormous market value for that. But if you're inside a large university, you have 500 projects, all of which claim they're going to cure cancer, and you can't give unconstrained resources to all of them because likely somewhere between 497 and 500 of them are going to fail, at that, right? So you're in this endless sort of competition for resources, and we're going to have to constrain it somehow. And in this constrained space, we're going to need to figure out how to continue to optimize, continue to be effective, and continue to push forward in performance. So I think, our future is changing, but it's still awfully bright in this post-exascale world. So then we can get back into the demise of civilization. Okay. Any thoughts on that? But usually we have a drink pause.
I'm glad you mentioned what you could do at a small university.
I'm at the University of Texas.
Well, before. Yeah. Now you're at a big university, but
yes, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to a comment that Karen made about digital twins, where the virtual world, the simulation, needs to be purpose built, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it means exascale is not required for digital twins. It depends on your purpose, right?
Yeah, I mean, depending on which twin, but yeah.
Yeah. But I'd like to also go back to Nicholas mentioned earlier in this conference that I'm a motorcycle enthusiast, and I'll say the phrase "small is beautiful," and you mentioned John Britton. There's another Kiwi, Burt Monroe, who's famous for the fastest Indian in the motorcycle racing. And I think there's like a spirit of innovation within New Zealand that says that it exemplifies the concept of something that's termed a lead user. And that means the user often knows best what they need. And it's a term from a book called Democratizing Innovation by Eric von Hippel, who's a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Business. But in his book, which is his part of the Commons, I forget the publishing Commons, but he definitely adheres to the philosophy of open source and information should be free. And one of his motivations for open source software is mainly what he was talking about, is that you want to unlock the tools of innovation and make them accessible to all. And say, do we need a new open source? I think what I was arguing for in my talk was that we have an opportunity to think about new innovations that could be actually performed in the hardware space. And so you can really do true hardware software co-design. And that then leads to opportunities for innovation where it's not just left to the hands of the big companies and the large company. They can certainly do their innovations, but if we really can exercise this balance, and even the little guys can develop innovative solutions, maybe not for production. Mm-hmm. They're not to create new product. They're not. Maybe we won't be competing with Samsung and Intel and TSMC, but we'll have proof of concept prototyping along with real performance data to lower the technical risk for trying new solutions that are not based on the roadmaps of the big vendors. And that's really one of the challenges that we have and opportunities we have moving forward. It does require investments like the CHIPS Act, and I will note I was giving the perspective of the U.S. CHIPS Act. Talked to Estrella about how there's a CHIPS Act activity in Europe. I know there's one in Japan. There are also some activities in some of our adversary nations, right? But the reality is there's some opportunities that are arising because of the end of Moore's Law.
Yep.
And so that's the innovation opportunity for innovation that can change the rules of the game. And Fernanda, I know you mentioned having cheap hardware kept you up at night. It doesn't sound like in a good way. But for me, that's the dream. So please.
So, but let's be real. The CHIPS Act is not here because we were worried about innovation at the end of Moore's Law. The CHIPS Act is here because we were worried China would take over Taiwan, which is where they're made, right? So
that's the supply chain part. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a research part.
And that's how we convinced our politicians that the risk was there, that we would lose access to things that are vital to our national security. And that goes back to his point, which is how do we communicate and do this outreach to the funders, right? And it can't be that we're going to sit here and say, or in a sense, lie to ourselves and say, well, okay, well, the end of Moore's Law is there, and this is how we got this funding. The reality is we got this funding for a lot of complex reasons that are not so clear, and we just have to tell different audiences what they wanted to hear as part of the complex reasons, right?
Yeah, but I think that's how the policy process works to some extent, right? And the fact that we didn't necessarily use the reason that we care about to motivate getting the funding we needed to achieve these goals isn't necessarily important, right? It's about finding the right, it's and I don't want to say, means justify the ends or anything like that, but the ends justify the means, but the take your pick. But yeah, I mean, it was not only the threat of China invading Taiwan, it was the threat of China taking the lead in AI and perhaps using AI to develop hypersonics, right? The generations ahead of us, right? So it was an economic-minded argument and a security-minded argument because that's what moves governments. But if we have different outcomes in mind, I think is not important, right? And how we're going to motivate it, you adapt the times and the place and the people. But in the end, I mean, I used to hear this in the response to DOE is that every 3 years you need a new 5-year plan. So that sounds totally different. So you can fund all the same people that did the same stuff. But size trying not to throw things at me. But but essentially, yes, whether we call it exascale or whatever we call it, right? Or
I think we're still.
name we give it, it's we know where we need to go, and there is the issue of what we need to do and how it's going to work, and then there's the issue of how you advocate for it, and they're not necessarily even touching circles in the Venn diagram.
We're still as a community, though, I would say in general, we're still as a community a little pert at vendors that we used to be able to walk into vendors, office and it's like, here's money. And now vendors are like, that's cute.
Yeah.
Really nice, so quaint.
That's so cute. And we can't do that. We're still hurt. I think we still feel like we're the big dogs. And, we've had to go through Core 1, at least on the U.S. side. We have to right. And that's exactly it. Like, we need to get used to it. We're not the big ones in the room anymore. And I think that constraint, a necessity is a mother of inventions. That constraint, I think, actually I'm excited about this. I'm excited that we're not the big dogs anymore because I think that there's going to be innovation from that constraint.
So let me provide a slightly different perspective to that, coming from the vendor perspective. Money is absolutely important.
So you're saying you need more money?
I'm not going to claim that profits and whatever don't drive roadmaps. That wouldn't be that wouldn't be speaking with integrity. However, I can tell you that I can speak for my group. I've seen other groups at not just 2 other large vendors that I've previously been at, but in talking to folks from AMD and talking to folks from NVIDIA, that and this is just guidance for a lot of the people in this community. There's a lot of expertise and intuition that this community brings, and having partnerships, even if it isn't massive dollar partnerships, is something of value because many companies, perhaps my immediately former employer aside, no, I'm sorry, I don't know, hopefully no, it's here, of course, it's being at many companies, I think this is true, that a lot of the people who are developing these machines, myself, my team, or teams at AMD, teams that are scientists and engineers like us, and they appreciate getting that information. So, one of the things that I would encourage is, yes, big checks help. Yes, being able to point to market drivers, but also coming with valuable, call it co-design, right? To use a term that we've been now using probably since we began those exascale swim lanes a decade and a half ago. That too does have value, right? So it isn't just but in the end, it is true that the technical directions that go are that succeed are the ones that are going to drive the biggest markets.
I want to make a mention.
Yeah, I was just thinking because of the comment Fernando started with. So how will it change that we are not the big fishes anymore on the market, and that the amount of counter partners for this co-design you are alluding to are getting smaller or less, getting less and less?
I don't think the DOE's been the big fish in the market for quite some time.
No, but I mean, I'm
the
just
last
thinking,
decade it was cloud, right?
That's true.
And the decade before that, it was the decade before that, it was the attack of the killer. It's been since probably the early '90s.
That is true, but there
which,
is a
as Nicholas
difference.
pointed out, I've been anyway. We really were the big fish.
But there is a difference now that, at least until now, we have always been able to procure the hardware or have a hardware developer as a discussion partner that we could choose them between, Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, whatever. We are starting to get now in a situation in which the cloud companies produce their own hardware, but they don't provide this hardware. We cannot buy it.
That's an important change.
So how will this change the game? So will we be able to compensate with things like the CHIPS Act, with own developments, this gap that has been open? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd rather have the opportunity to find out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, we still have procurement options, and I understand what you're saying. And certainly the loss of integrators has been a big part, although, again, come from the university perspective where we never thought we had influence on the chip place. With one thing that I built my career around Thomas Sterling's early statement that in HPC, we need to be bottom feeding scum suckers. It was really inspiring words that I lived by. But that was his exact quote about how we were going to make things work in the Beowulf world, right? Is figure out what the commodity markets are producing the most of, and then figure out how to leverage that. And the fact that in the short term, the AI explosion has created a lot of problems for us, mostly because it's driven up the cost of GPUs, relatively dramatically. It's driven a lot of the side players out of the industry. Everybody's totally focused on how do we make tensors work at 16 bits. But but in the long run, having this sort of, and I think scalable AI, which in the end is still little matrix multiplies, right, is fundamentally very similar to HPC. And having this explosion in the size of the market for that in the long run is going to be good for us, because some of these cloud vendors might start selling their chips. Somebody might sell knockoffs of those chips. Maybe we're going to see a different set of players, but there's going to be chips we can buy, and computing is still a huge marketplace. And I just watched this happen over the sort of commoditization of clusters, where it was like, okay, well, the silicon's really expensive, so maybe we'll buy commodity processors, but our networks are still something you can't do in the commodity market. And now Microsoft buys 29,000 miles of InfiniBand cable, right? So yeah, you can, right? You can build those topologies, we can run them. And it's like, well, okay, but the software needs to be different. And it's like, no, you don't really need a different OS than Linux to run this stuff. It's like, well, we need integrators who know special things about supercomputing, and we've never used them in the petabyte machines, right? So so I'm not sure that's going to pan out either. And so it will be interesting to see how this evolves with AI. But I think, again, the onus is going to be on us to once again adapt to where the market's going. But I think we have options that we can adapt to. So I'm not like it's all over. Yeah, when HP stops selling praise, we'll all doom.
Yeah. Not only that, but somebody, I don't know whether it was on the panel earlier today, commented that as you look at scalable, some of these flagship AI products, they have a lot of HPC-ish needs, right? The scalability, the messaging that you talked about. So they're at some point going to, is just like a decade ago, somebody said, the cloud providers, that they didn't care about networks, and now they do, right? As you get to a certain scale, as you get to large, a lot of the technologies that this community has helped drive, I think, are going to be needed, and perhaps at some point, parallel to they will be, but at some point, as they continue to drive larger, some of their technologies, we should look at it as a partnership, not as a adversarial relationship.
Just want to throw in quickly that I think the other thing, different than the Beowulf time, is this time, because they've adopted a bunch of our technologies, we have a lot to offer back to that community that we didn't have in the past. And if Karen was here, and she already had to head to the airport, but she would say algorithms, right? I know plenty of people who say that neural nets are great, but they're using 1850s numerics, right? Gradient descent still works, but it may not be the most efficient way to solve every problem. Essentially, they're in a high dimensional space trying to descend to the lowest energy solution, right? And there's lots of optimizations there. So we can make it more of a two-way street, as you're saying, Bob, and partner on these kinds of things. And
I'll also add that from the standpoint of scientific discovery, the national labs, the universities have a lot of scientific databases that actually now have value if you want to tackle scientific challenge problems. And just like, Andrew Jones couldn't talk about the cost for licensing for IP from New York Times, et cetera. But the reality is, if we're going to tackle challenge problems or with climate change and PFAS chemicals and new battery technologies, we have scientific databases that actually need to be part of new foundation models. And that's not something that the cloud providers necessarily have. They might want to absorb all of that for free, right? Yeah. But but the reality is there are bases for collaboration. So
And
I think
No, I am trying to. I was going to do the following. Fernanda, go ahead.
following up, thank you, Jen, for throwing that bone to me, because coming up in my talk, we'll talk about how we're going to connect these data.
Very good.
But I think to answer your question is, when everything is changing from underneath us, the only option we have is to go up into the stack and do a better job with the abstraction. And we've already seen that change coming. So, Cocos and Raja and all of those projects came from the thought that, well, everything is changing from beneath us. And, when I was working in the ECP project, I was co-PI in the Cocos project. It was exactly that. It was that fear that everything's changing beneath us. We can't keep doing this over and over again. So I think software is going to improve tremendously because of this constraint. I think abstraction layers are going to improve, dramatically because of this. We might even finally see the rise of DSLs. I know we've been talking about this for a long time, but we might actually see the rise of DSLs. And then lastly, it's exactly that. It's just to look at the old paradigms of algorithms and data that have been sitting there because we were chasing speed, but now we can sit back and say, like, well, we're going to do with what we can, but what else is it? What other innovation is there waiting for us? And connecting data and re-looking at algorithms, I think that would be the next thing. I'm excited about it. Actually, I've changed my mind. I like the fact that there's chiplets now.
It's closed on a question. I mean,
panels.
I can sleep, but...
Very good.
panelists, can you please answer questions from the floor?
Having fun arguing with each other.
Now, echo chamber start.
Over here, yellow mic.
Yeah.
Oh, up. Yeah, we go.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. This panel's been fantastic. This is one of the most lively multi-core world debates I think I've ever seen. Jim's presentation with co-design, talking about some of the material science and stuff, just had me thinking on that a bit. And then Fernanda mentioning the Veritasium video with blue LEDs. Haven't watched it yet. It's on my list to watch next week. Heard nothing but amazing things. But I'm wondering, almost looking at, traditional conventional computing, if there's much more that material science can possibly do here. So it seems like for decades we've seen eye-catching headlines around stuff like graphene transistors switching at, 100 gigahertz or something crazy like that. Recently, a few months ago, we had all that hype around a potential superconductor, and fortunately, unsurprisingly, that didn't materialize. But I'm just wondering if there's really any reason for optimism in this space where we might see something like one of those 10x gains in performance or efficiency, or if it's going to be more of the, standard iterative 10% here or 15% there thing.
No, I'd say one thing you're struggling with is, our standard iterative in silicon for a long time was 50% here, 50% again the next year, 50% again the following year, repeat for 40 years until it stopped, right? Which I think does open up the possibility of new materials. And I don't know enough about the physics, which again, I've read about a ton of this stuff even 25 years ago, of graphene or, biomaterials or other things to make us really switch that much faster, because it's been amazing how far they've been able to push silicon down to the, when we're at 10 atom wide features, do this. Well, I guess we could use smaller atoms technically, but but I think there's that opportunity. But it's back to the place and context. Nowadays, if I was trying to pitch graphene research, I'd say think of how much faster your AI would be, which is not how I would have pitched it 10 years ago. To put it, but yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the physics, but I think the opportunity is there.
I don't see.
Anybody else?
I agree with you, Nicholas, that after having claimed each of the panelists that they are staying awake at night because of this or that reason, they are very, very energetic. So something
No,
is big. So I just want to make the comment that a very simple answer to your fundamental question as to why we need bigger machines is embedded in the question itself. So we need to remind ourselves that S at the end of exaflops is not the plural of exaflops, is per second. This is the key aspect of it. We need to model and do something about the melting of the glaciers before they melt, and we need to be able to design an airplane in 2 years instead of 5 years. So we need to solve the national security problems that Tuka and Sai discussed in a timely fashion, and in addition to the curiosity driven. So I think this is fundamental to the fact that we have technical problems, societal problems that require a timely answer. And given the complexity of the problems, we need bigger and faster machines.
Totally agree.
I wrote down lots of stuff. I'm gonna try and cut to the chase. I'm gonna just say a bunch of things that you guys can just answer or not answer as you like. So the argument about the moon, there, as you know, many people would say we could have used that money to do a lot of other things, and the same thing could be said about HPC, and it can be said about a lot of things, and that's probably part of the reason why people are like, why are we spending all this money when we could be doing whatever my favorite project.
How much do we spend on cat videos?
Yeah,
for it now.
so
Surfing.
that's the first thing. The other thing is I think it was you who put up something that said, watch this space. Here's where the vendors, here's where the money, we're going to be procuring stuff. I'm not sure, but I worry about the U.S. budgetary process because
What U.S. budgetary process? Yeah.
So there's, I think it was here. Because
It was
it's like,
I who put up the roadmap.
yeah, I think so. And it's like, yeah, because we'll be buying stuff here. So maybe that's why they're not the big
Well,
ones.
the U.S. roadmaps have an apocalypse
Yeah.
on them now. So
So that's a little frustrating. Probably the uncertainty there is a little bit tough, which is maybe good.
But first, the government has to get out a continuing resolution, but that's okay.
yeah, some year that might not.
And I think you mentioned the engineering problems of weather, and I had to really scratch my head about that because weather is a science problem unless you engineer a solution. Because Fred Brooks, a Turing Award winner, said scientists build to learn and engineers learn to build, which I always thought was very interesting way of looking at it. And I did my undergrad in computer science at Liberal Arts University. I did my PhD in an engineering school. Totally different ways of looking at the world. So I feel really privileged to having seen it that way, and I use both now. But I was just wondering, what are the engineering pieces of weather that you think we could do? And then what does New Zealand's nuclear-free status mean about doing nuclear computations in HPC in New Zealand? I'll just leave that one. Are we still nuclear-free if we're computing stuff? I don't know that we're
You might
computing
want
stuff.
fusion power.
Yeah.
Says a Texan.
Yeah, and that's about it. And there's the last thing is the power curve really worried me a little bit. It's the fact that here's the world's consumption of power, and then here's all the power being used by HPC. So as a non-HPC guy, I'm thinking, wow, we're spending all of this energy on HPC. So I don't know how you can.
Well, it's not going to. It's unsustainable.
Right. Yeah.
So the reality is, if you want to still make progress and improvements in computing performance, we better start worrying about energy efficient performance.
So let's see. Why is weather engineering? So where I was trying to go with that comment is there are some fundamental science problems, like QCD and things like that more or less could absorb infinite computing power, right? Like IATA scales wouldn't be enough. What I meant by weather being an engineering problem is that we have the formulas. We just need to get a little bit more computing power, a little bit finer resolution, things like that. It isn't my understanding. I'm not a domain scientist, as I said, so somebody playing me wrong. But it isn't like we need fundamentally new science breakthroughs to be able.
Satoshi showed a very good example. Just needed 5 points to collect weather.
Well, they've been saying we just need I mean, that's been true for a bit. We just need a little bit finer resolution. But I think by an engineering problem, I mean, it's sort of, you know, I don't want to say it's not innovation isn't needed, but it's sort of this an evolution towards being able to get the solution rather than some scientific breakthrough. That's what I had meant to imply about that.
Yeah, what
I don't know if that helps.
you're saying there, and I agree with it, right, is we know we need climate and weather models at a particular resolution to be effective, and we can engineer a solution to get there from what we know about. I mean, yeah, we need better initial conditions, we need bigger models that run faster, right? That's we can engineer the solution to those problems to get there without needing a, you know, I'm still thinking that, we have to make a different kind of offering to the god of weather in order to make this work, right? We've got the mechanism, right, to do this, and we just need to engineer the systems to do it. I would also say that once you know what's going on with climate and weather, there's a lot of engineering problems around what you do about it, and it's not necessarily weather modification. It might be mitigations, right? You know, do we need to jack up Jakarta so it doesn't sink into the ocean?
I would push back a little bit in that the weather models are really bad, and they're always going to get better. Find a little more.
No, we're not going to trash weather models right now. Actually, I know that community well. It's amazing, and I'll tell you why it's amazing right now. I lived in Florida all through Hurricane Andrew, and the difference between how much time we have now knowing where that hurricane's going to fall versus 10 years ago, it's dramatic.
I meant climate, not weather. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I meant climate.
Yeah,
because I do a lot.
I was like, I'm defending my people.
I do a lot with the Antarctic.
I think
tell you that the climate model.
Climate's maybe on the border. I did say weather when I said the engineering.
Yeah. But even then, a huge amount of it is data acquisition. You know how hard it is to start a 1 kilometer resolution model that has data points for the ocean temperature at all depths at 1 kilometer at all points in the globe that you have measured simultaneously in order to start the model. And what used to happen in climate models is you just start the ocean at 0 and you run 1 million years, and whatever temperature you get to, that's the one you use. When it looks close to a few buoys, and you just run forward from there, because we don't have 3D atmospheric and ocean models that can give us all the data we need at every point. We're doing inverse problems and forcing functions to do some data assimilation for the points we have, which one makes it 100 times more computationally intense, and two means there's fundamental uncertainties until we have better data.
So to your moon comment, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer on this one. I just sort of stated, my view of where I guess how I would vote. I'm probably in the minority of U.S. voters, well, not probably. Yeah. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to the moon comment. What I was trying to imply is, when individuals decide how they're going to, want to spend their money, how much of it are they willing to do for pure science? And you're right, we could have done something else. But the question is, a lot of voters probably, if they really thought about it, would actually not spend any money on science, which, I mean, it's just the reality, right? And so my comment was, anybody has to do this, regardless of whether they want a faster race car, or they want to go to the moon, or they want to do, figure out the subatomic particles, or figure out where dark matter. You have to present what it is that you're trying to do in a way that's compelling to other people. And, I think kind of implicitly we're bashing politicians because they didn't. But I've seen this even within technical groups, within companies. And so, the people who are working on the software versus the hardware, and then the people who are working on the operating system versus the runtime. It doesn't matter. There's always differences. There's differences of opinion. People have gotten to a certain point of view because they have beliefs, and the way that you are able to drive your belief forward is to be able to bridge that gap, to be able to reach somebody and explain why your vision is, compelling to them as well. So that was really about the moon comment. Not that there was a right or wrong thing, but
So sorry to interrupt, but it's time to go for lunch.
Oh yeah.